He said go ahead in French first and then in English, and both times he was smiling. And both times the smile was the particular smile of a man who has spent his entire adult life being the largest thing in any room he has ever entered, and who has never once had a reason to reconsider what that means. He put one enormous finger against his own sternum, tapped twice, and said, go ahead in that deep French accent, and 400 people in the Tonight Show studio in Burbank laughed with him because the idea was genuinely funny. A 140-pound man in a dark jacket was going to move 420 pounds of André René Roussimoff with a punch thrown from 1 inch away. The small man did not laugh. He placed his knuckles against that chest, 1 inch out, and said quietly, and with no performance in the saying, all right, I am 80 years old. My name is Thomas Reed. I was in the 5th row of that studio the night it happened, and I have been thinking about the next 4 seconds for 52 years. This is the whole story from the beginning, including the parts that happened before those 4 seconds and the parts that happened after them that nobody has told correctly.
It started with a phone call that Fred de Cordova made in November of 1972 that he would later describe as either the best decision he made that season or the most reckless, depending on who was asking and how much wine had been consumed. Fred was the producer of The Tonight Show. He had been doing it for a year, which in Tonight Show terms meant he had a year of accumulated knowledge about what made Johnny Carson's audience sit forward and what made them lean back. And what he had learned was that the thing that made them sit forward was almost always the thing he hadn't planned for, but had created the conditions for. He wanted to create conditions. He had Bruce Lee already confirmed for the segment, first guest, standard booking, the martial arts conversation and demonstration that Bruce's appearances always produced, and that always generated more audience mail than any other segment type the show ran. Bruce had one condition that the show had come to understand was absolute. No advance announcement, surprise only. Fred had agreed and had kept the booking out of the program and out of the pre-show communication. He needed a second guest. He needed someone whose physical presence would create a specific kind of contrast with Bruce's, the contrast that makes a room understand through its eyes what the conversation is about before the conversation begins. He needed someone who would make the question of what physical capability actually means visible before anyone had said a word about it. He called André the Giant's manager. André was the most physically imposing human being on Earth in 1972. This is not hyperbole. 7 feet 4, 420 pounds, the specific size of someone who has not merely grown large, but has been produced by something that operates outside the normal range of human biology. He had been wrestling professionally since his late teens, had spent years on the road performing in arenas across Europe and North America, and had developed in that time a public persona that was warm and funny and enormous in every dimension simultaneously. He was also, and this is the part that mattered for Fred's purposes, a man who had a very specific relationship with his own body. André's condition was called acromegaly. It produced the growth. It also produced everything that came with the growth, which was a body that had been extraordinary and was also, constantly, difficult. The joints that bore 420 pounds wore down in ways that normal joints did not. The world was not built for his dimensions, in ways that were constant and daily, and that most people who watched him on television had no framework for understanding. He had spent his adult life as the most physically remarkable person anywhere he went, and that remarkableness was inseparable from the specific weight it carried. Fred had seen footage of André from a recent wrestling event. What he had noticed was not the size, which was visible to everyone. What he noticed was something in the way André watched the things around him, a quality of attention, specific and patient, the attention of someone who has learned to observe carefully, because the world has always been slightly sideways to their experience of it. He thought that quality plus Bruce Lee's philosophy of force and movement might produce something worth seeing. He made the call. André's manager heard the words Tonight Show and said yes before the details were finished. The pre-show negotiation established two things. André would appear as a surprise second guest after Bruce's solo segment, and the format would be an open conversation about physical capability and what different kinds of training produce. Light, interesting, no physical demonstrations. Those were the stated terms. Fred understood, having been in television long enough to understand these things, that stated terms for a segment involving the largest human being on Earth and the most precise martial artist alive were terms that would hold until the moment they didn't. He prepared accordingly. I arrived at the studio at 8 in the evening for the taping. I had gotten the tickets through a friend who worked in the NBC mailroom, the same way most people got Tonight Show tickets in those years, through a connection who had access to the overflow. I was in the 5th row, which on a Tonight Show set put me about 25 feet from the guest couch, close enough to see facial expressions. I had been to 3 tapings before this one and had developed a sense for the temperature of the room before a show started, the specific warmth that meant the evening was going to be good versus the polite warmth that meant it was going to be fine. That night, the room had the first kind. Not from any particular information, just the ambient energy of 400 people who had dressed up on a Wednesday evening and were ready for something. Johnny's monologue was good, political jokes that landed clean, and a callback to the previous night's show that rewarded the regulars. Then he introduced Bruce. The wave of recognition that went through the studio when Bruce Lee walked through the curtain was the specific wave I had heard about from people who had been at previous tapings, the sound of recognition moving through a room at different speeds as different people arrived at the same understanding. By the time he reached the desk, it had completed and become a sustained, genuine response. He shook Johnny's hand. He sat down. Johnny leaned forward. He said, "You've been on this show before, and I've been thinking since that appearance about a question I didn't ask well enough. What is it that people consistently misunderstand about what you do?" Bruce was quiet for a moment, actually thinking rather than gathering a prepared answer. He said, "They understand the performance of it. They understand what it looks like when it works. What they don't understand is why it works. The thing underneath the visual." Johnny said, "And what is the thing underneath it?" Bruce said, "The relationship between force and the body that delivers it. Most people think about force in terms of size. The bigger the body, the more force it produces. This is approximately true in a limited set of circumstances, but the more interesting question is what happens to force when it's organized correctly. What a body that understands how to transmit force can produce relative to its size." Johnny said, "Give me a specific example." Bruce said, "A punch thrown from 1 inch away by a body that knows how to transmit force produces more energy at impact than a punch thrown from 2 feet away by a body that doesn't. The distance is not the source of the power. The body is the source of the power, and the distance is just the distance the knuckle travels." Johnny said, "I want to see that." Bruce said, "I'd need someone willing to be the receiving end of the demonstration." Johnny smiled at the camera, the smile he used when he had something planned. He said, "It might just be your lucky night, because I have a second guest who I think the audience is going to find very interesting. A man who, when I describe him, I'm not sure description quite covers it. Ladies and gentlemen, André the Giant." The curtain opened. The sound that went through the studio was different from the sound for Bruce. Bruce's entrance had produced a wave of warm recognition. André's entrance produced something closer to a collective recalibration of the room's understanding of what a human being is allowed to be. He came through the curtain, and the studio did what studios do when something occupies a different category of space from everything else in it, which is to contract. The set seemed smaller. The desk seemed smaller. Johnny, who was 6 feet tall and not a small man, looked like someone's younger brother. André walked toward the desk with the specific walk of someone who has been walking through spaces built for different dimensions for so long that the navigation has become unconscious. He came toward Johnny, and the two of them shook hands, and the hand that Johnny shook disappeared inside the hand that was shaking it. Then André turned toward the couch. He looked at Bruce. Bruce looked back. What passed between them in that look? I was 25 feet away, and close enough to see clearly. It was not a challenge, and it was not dismissal. It was the specific mutual assessment of two people who are each, in their own domain, extraordinary, encountering each other in a shared space for the first time, and taking an accurate measurement. André sat down. The chair groaned in the specific way that chairs groan when they have been told by their engineers to hold 250 pounds and are currently holding 420. Johnny said, "André, welcome back to the show. And I want to pick up right where we were, which was Bruce explaining something about the relationship between force and body size. What do you make of what you heard?" André said, in the deep French accent that filled the room without apparent effort, "I make that a man of my size should not need to worry about force from a man of his size." He said it with warmth. It was not hostile. It was the genuine observation of a man who has navigated the world from a perspective where size has been the primary variable in every physical encounter he has ever had. Bruce said, "That's the assumption that makes the demonstration interesting." André looked at him. He said, "And what would the demonstration show me?" Bruce said, "That size is the variable everyone focuses on, and it's not the most important one." André said, "I have thrown men twice your size across a ring." Bruce said, "I know. The question is, what happens when throwing is not the tool that's being used?" Andre's expression did the thing I had been watching from the fifth row since he sat down. The specific thing I had noticed, and that I want to describe as accurately as I can, because it was not the thing I expected to see on the face of the largest man in the room. He looked genuinely curious, not performing curiosity, actually curious. The curiosity of someone who has spent his life being the variable that changes every situation, and has just heard someone suggest that there might be a variable he hasn't considered. He said, "What tool is being used?" Bruce said, "Force organized at the point of contact rather than generated across a distance, 1 inch." Andre looked at the distance between them on the couch. He said, 1 inch. Bruce said, "Yes." Andre said, "And you believe this produces a result worth demonstrating?" Bruce said, "I think it produces a result worth experiencing." The studio was very quiet in the specific way of a room that is following something carefully and does not want to interrupt. Andre looked at Johnny. Johnny said, "I'm sitting here pretending I can improve this conversation." "I cannot improve this conversation." The audience laughed. Andre looked back at Bruce. He said, "Show me." And here is where the evening split from everything anyone in that studio had expected it to be. Because Andre did not say it as a challenge. He said it as a request. The genuine request of someone who has heard something that interests him and wants to understand it the way he understands things, through direct experience rather than through description. Bruce said, "You understand what you're agreeing to." Andre said, "I understand that a man half my size is going to try to move me with a punch from 1 inch away." "Yes, I understand this." He smiled. The warm, enormous smile that Andre used when something amused him genuinely. He said, "I have been moved by exactly no one in 23 years. I am curious about the next 30 seconds. He tapped his sternum with one finger. The finger alone was the size of most people's wrists. He said, "Go ahead." The audience laughed. And that laugh was the specific laugh of people who have found something funny, because it is genuinely funny. The image of what was about to happen. 140 pounds versus 421 inch of distance. Physics that seemed to argue strongly against the smaller party. Bruce did not laugh. He stood up from the couch. He moved to stand in front of Andre, who was still seated, which meant Bruce standing and Andre sitting, put their heights at roughly comparable levels, Bruce's face about level with Andre's collarbone. Bruce placed his right fist against Andre's sternum, 1 inch out. His shoulders were down, his elbow was down, his arm was quiet. Nothing about the arm communicated force. Nothing about the arm communicated anything except a closed hand in light contact with a very large chest. The studio went quiet, the way studios go quiet, when 400 people have simultaneously decided not to make noise. I was in the fifth row, 25 feet away. I want to tell you what I saw and what I heard, in that order. Because they were different experiences. What I saw, a very small movement in Bruce's rear foot, a quarter turn of the heel, a rotation in the hips that was present in the body before it was present in the arm. The arm itself did nothing visible. The arm was the end of something, not the beginning of it, and the beginning was happening in the floor and traveling upward through a body that had spent 20 years learning how to be a channel for exactly this kind of event. And then the fist detonated against that chest. What I heard, a sound that I have tried to describe to people for 52 years and that I have never succeeded in describing adequately. It was not a slap, and it was not a thud. It was a single, compressed report, dense and deep, the sound of force arriving at a specific point, with complete economy, nothing wasted, nothing distributed, all of it concentrated in the last inch. And 420 pounds of Andrei René Roussimoff moved, not cartoon movie moved, not staggering across the stage moved, really moved. 3 steps of real, actual, involuntary backward travel. The kind of movement that happens when a body has received a force that exceeds its expectation, and its expectation was, reasonably, very high. If you think those 3 steps were the most extraordinary thing that happened in the next 60 seconds, you were not watching Andre's face. He came to rest against the edge of the couch behind him, one hand catching the armrest. He sat down again, not gracefully, but not hard either. The controlled descent of someone who has processed what's happened and is managing the landing. His expression. I was 25 feet away, and I had a clear sight line, and I watched his expression from the moment the punch landed through the next several seconds, and what was on his face was not what the audience expected to see there, and it was not what I expected to see there, and it might not be what you expect either. He was not angry. He was not embarrassed. He was not the face of a man who has been surprised in a way that feels like a threat. He was the face of a man who has just had a room revealed to him that he did not know was in a building he thought he knew completely. He sat against the couch armrest, and he looked at Bruce with an expression of pure, total, absorbed astonishment. Not the performance of astonishment. The real thing. The real thing on the face of the largest man in the room, who had spent his entire life being the fact that ended arguments before they started, looking at a man a third of his size, with the specific expression of someone who has found something they did not know existed. Then he started to laugh. It came up slowly. The disbelieving laugh that starts in the chest and builds. The laugh of someone who has encountered something that their entire experience of the world said was impossible, and who has found, on the other side of the impossibility, not violation, but delight. He sat there laughing, one hand on his chest where the punch had landed, breathing carefully, and the laugh was genuine and warm and enormous, the way everything about André was enormous. And 400 people in the studio laughed with him, not nervously, not with the relief of tension released, with the full participation of people who have watched something extraordinary happen and have been given permission to find it extraordinary and funny at the same time. Johnny Carson, from behind his desk, said nothing. He looked at the two of them with the expression of a host who has spent 12 years producing live television and has just watched something that 12 years of producing live television had not prepared him for. André looked up from his laughing. He looked at Bruce. He said, and the accent was thick with the laugh still in it, "How?" Bruce crossed to him. He put out his hand. André took it, and Bruce pulled, and André came up off the couch armrest, 420 pounds assisted by 140, and what was remarkable was not that it worked, it was that the quality of the help was real, Bruce actually pulling, not performing a pull, putting something genuine into it, and André accepting the help without any of the pride that might have prevented him from accepting it. They were standing. André was still holding his chest, not from pain, from something more like memory, the hand going back to the place where the information had arrived. He said, "How did you do that?" He said it the way he had said it when he was sitting, the same voice, but now that the laugh had completed, the quality of the question had changed. It was not delighted anymore. It was serious. The genuine question of someone who has encountered a mechanism they don't understand and need to understand. Bruce said, "Your body is organized for resistance. When something comes toward you, every piece of what you've built knows how to brace against it. The muscle, the mass, all of it is trained to stop things." André said, "Yes." Bruce said, "I was not coming toward you. I was already in contact with you, from 1 inch. When something is already in contact, there is nothing to brace against. The force goes through, rather than into. And the more there is to go through," André said, "the more there is to move." He said it quietly. The specific quality of someone completing a sentence that they have just understood. Bruce said, "Yes." André looked at his own hands, the hands that had thrown men twice Bruce's size, across wrestling rings across 2 continents. He turned them over and looked at the back of them, and then at the palm, and then at Bruce. He said, "And this cannot be resisted." Bruce said, "Not in the way you resist, not with mass or with muscle. It would need a different response." André said, "What response?" Bruce said, "You'd need to move before it arrives, to not be where it lands." André considered this. He had the expression of someone doing genuine mathematics with a new set of variables. He said, "But you are already touching me when you throw it." Bruce said, "Yes." André said, "So I cannot move away." Bruce said, "Not the way you normally move. The movement would need to be internal rather than spatial. You would need to redirect rather than resist." André was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are saying that my body works against me in this situation." Bruce said, "I'm saying your body is the most extraordinary instrument of resistance I've ever been in the room with. I'm also saying that resistance is one of 2 responses to force, and the other one is not available to a body that only knows the first." The studio was very quiet. Not the quiet of tension, the quiet of absorption, 400 people all doing the same work at the same time, which was trying to understand something that had just been demonstrated in a way that made understanding possible, and finding that the understanding was arriving. André looked at Johnny. He said, "You did not tell me this was going to happen." Johnny said, "I knew you could move 3 times his weight across a ring. I was curious about the other direction." André said, with the warm, enormous laugh returning for a moment, "Yes, I see that now." He looked back at Bruce. He said, "Sit down with me." Bruce sat, and what happened for the next 14 minutes of that segment was the thing that I have thought about more than the punch, more than the 3 steps backward, more than the expression on André's face when the laugh arrived. André asked questions. He asked them the way he asked everything, directly and specifically, and without any performance of knowing more than he knew or less than he knew. He asked about the 1-inch punch, about the mechanics of it, about what a body needed to develop over how many years to produce that kind of organized force from that kind of distance. He asked about Jeet Kune Do, about the philosophy of using what works regardless of where it came from, about the idea of adapting rather than resisting. And then he said something that made the fifth row, my row, produce a sound I had not heard from any section of any audience at any taping I had been to. He said, I have never had a smaller body. Not ever. Not for one day of my life. Since I was 14 years old, I have been the largest person anywhere I have gone. You understand what that means. He said it to Bruce, not to the audience, not to the cameras. He said it means I have never had to understand force from the other side. Force has always been mine. The world has always organized itself around my size. I have never needed to learn what a smaller body learns, which is how to use what it has when what it has is not sufficient by itself. He paused. He said, what you just showed me is that I have been using half the information. My whole life, half the information. Bruce said, you have been using the half that's been sufficient. André said, until tonight. Bruce said, until tonight. It had been. André looked at him. He said, and now you are going to tell me it was never actually sufficient, that it only looked sufficient because no one applied the other half to it. Bruce said, I'm going to tell you that what you have is extraordinary and real, and I have never been in the same room with anything like it. And also that understanding what you have requires understanding what it can't do. André was quiet. Then he said, the bigger the bell. Bruce said, yes. André said, the longer it rings. He said it to himself, understanding something, filing something. Johnny Carson had stopped doing what hosts do, which is manage. He had his arms folded and his chin slightly down and the expression of a man who is watching a conversation happen that his show has produced and that his show is not large enough to contain. At some point, near the end, Johnny said, I want to ask both of you a question. Not about the punch, about what it means. They both looked at him. He said, André, you've spent 20 years being the largest physical presence in any room you've entered. Bruce, you've spent 20 years becoming the most precisely organized physical presence in any room you've entered. If the two of you are in the same room for one night, what does the other one teach you? André went first. He said, he teaches me that I have been looking at force from the outside. I have seen what I can do with it, what it produces when it is mine. I have never had to think about what it feels like when it arrives from somewhere else, what it does when the body that receives it does not know how to respond. He said, turning to Bruce, now I know what it feels like. I am going to think about that for a long time. Bruce said, he teaches me that what I can produce from a body my size has limits that I don't normally encounter. I can do what I did tonight, because the force travels through rather than into. If what I was meeting had known how to redirect rather than resist, the result would have been different. He teaches me the ceiling of what I know. The studio was quiet. Then André said something that produced in the fifth row a sound that I have never heard from a studio audience before, or since. 400 people making a noise that was not a laugh and not applause, but the specific involuntary sound of people who have heard something true, said simply. He said, you know, I have been asked many times in my life what it is like to be the largest man in any room. People want to know if it is frightening, if it is lonely, if it is wonderful. I have never had a good answer. The honest answer is that it is all of those things, and none of them adequately. It is simply what it is. I did not choose it, and it did not choose me. It happened, and I have lived inside it. He paused. He said, tonight is the first time that someone smaller than me has shown me something about my own size that I did not know. The first time in 23 years. And what he has shown me is not a weakness, it is an incompleteness. There is a difference. A weakness is something to fix, an incompleteness is something to learn. He looked at Bruce. He said, I would like to learn. Bruce said, Tuesday. Come to Culver City. André said, what is in Culver City? Bruce said, a space with a rubber floor and no cameras. André said, Tuesday. Johnny looked at the camera. He said, I have been doing this for 12 years. I have made this show with every kind of person that Los Angeles produces, and some that it imports. And I want to tell you something about tonight that I mean completely. What you just watched was not a demonstration, and it was not a conversation. It was two people telling each other the truth about something in real time, and learning something from the telling. I don't know what to call that, except rare. He went to commercial. After the taping, I stayed in my seat for a while. The audience was slow to leave, the specific slowness of people who have been somewhere and are not ready to stop being there. The woman next to me, who I had not spoken to all evening, said to her companion, "Did that actually happen?" The companion said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't know those two things could exist in the same room." The companion said, "Apparently they can." I drove home that night, and I sat in my kitchen and I thought about the 5-row view I had of Andre's face in the seconds after the punch, the laugh that was not about humor, the hand on the chest that was not about pain, the questions that came after, specific and real and without any need to be seen asking them. And I thought about what he said, that it was the first time in 23 years that someone smaller had shown him something about his own size that he did not know. That there is a difference between a weakness and an incompleteness. Bruce Lee died 7 months after that Wednesday. He was 32 years old. I heard the news on the radio, and I sat with it for a long time. I thought about Culver City, about Tuesday, about a rubber floor and no cameras and what would have happened in that space, between 140 pounds and 420. About Andre, asking questions for 14 minutes, the way someone asks questions when they have found something they genuinely need to understand. Andre died in 1993. He was 46 years old. His body had produced everything it could produce and had finished producing it. I have thought about what he said near the end of that segment for 30 years, about what it means to live inside a size you didn't choose, about what it means for someone to show you, for the first time in 23 years, something about the thing you have been living inside that you didn't know was there, about the difference between a weakness and an incompleteness. That distinction. That specific distinction that he arrived at in real time on a Wednesday night on a live television stage, while still feeling in his chest where the punch had landed, is the thing I have thought about most from that evening. Not the punch, not the 3 steps backward. That. I am 80 years old. I was in the 5th row. That's the whole story.